Alright, so let's take a look at setting up an architectural exterior type scene with Mental Ray and 3ds Max. Here you see I've loaded the scene into 3ds Max, and right now it's set up to use the default scanline renderer. So the first thing that I want to do is go ahead and assign Mental Ray. The object here already has some materials applied to it. I've used A&D materials. I believe for everything here on the scene you could use Pro materials or whatever. Generally the A&D, the Pro materials, and this fast SSS skin materials are the ones that I use the most of. So I've got the materials applied to the object here. I just want to set up a daylight system here for it. So what I'll do is go ahead and create a daylight system, and I keep going here. That's just my habit. Of course, you can go to create lights and daylight system, whichever method works best for you. And when you do, it's going to say you're creating a daylight system. Would you like to use exposure control? I'm going to say yes. And generally you should, unless you of course going to do your tone mapping outside of 3ds Max. So we now have a daylight system added to this scene, and with my configuration it comes in loaded as a standard light and a skylight. So I just need to come in and change it to Mental Ray Sun and Mental Ray Sky. And what I like to do is, of course, you can go in and enter the date and time and location if you want to, and that can be animated to control the placement of the sun. But for the tutorial here, I'm just going to put it manual so that I can just, drag that around however I want to here, and leave it to me to mess that up. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I have that in the viewport now. What I'd like to do is, in this viewport here, come in and enable the viewport background, just so that I can see the sun and how the sky looks here in this background as I move around. And what I need to do is enable this viewport. So now as I move this, darn it, now as I move this thing around, I can see how things are going to look here. And actually I'm just going to come in and freeze this compass rose, prevent me from selecting that again. And of course, if you have a nice video card, which I don't, if you do, you can enable the viewport shadows, and you'll actually see the shadows here in the viewport from the Mental Ray Sky as well. Mental Ray Sun, I'm sorry. So at this point what I want to do is set up my exposure control, and let me just come in here, and what you'll do is use the photographic exposure control. This should be the default values here. You'll probably see something like 0.15, 0.25, 1, 6500. That's probably what the default values look like. What I normally do is decrease this. I generally don't like that highest level of EV value here, or 15. I think something like 14 will give me the correct amount of brightness that I'm looking for. So what I'll do is leave that the way it is, and then of course I want to set up indirect illumination here. So I'm going to use Final Gather for this exterior, because generally for exterior scenes like this I just use Final Gather alone, because it does a really good job without having the need to set up global illumination and worry about the photons, having to focus those on the scene here and having them bounce out into space and have to worry about that. So generally for exteriors I use Final Gather. For interior scenes I use a combination of global illumination and Final Gather. Alright, so Final Gather is enabled, and what I want to do is go ahead and just use, I guess, this low preset. I'm going to leave the samples on this low setting here, just because I'm just testing this out for now. No need to increase that until I'm ready for the final render. The render size here I'm going to decrease just so it'll fit within the frame of this video here. So I will decrease that to, let's say, 450 by 600, and go ahead and give this a render. Okay, so that looks okay. There are some areas, you can see some spots here. That's coming from the low sampling, and so I'm not really concerned about that yet, because for the final render I'm just going to increase the final gather precision, and that should take care of these areas. But I use a low setting during the setup phase. Even probably you could get by with the draft setting. Of course, what you'd like to do also is increase the number of bounces here. Generally, for exterior scenes, I normally use 3 or 4 bounces. So, in looking at this, I want a little more contrast in this image, maybe some more unique lighting. So what I want to do is go into my daylight system and uncheck this inherit from mental ray sky on the mental ray sun parameters. And I want this to be a little bit warmer, so I'm going to increase the red value here, decrease the saturation slightly, and I believe I want this a little bit lower in the horizon. I guess leaving it something like here would be good. Okay, I also want to adjust my exposure control. I'm going to increase the highlights and burn just because I want a little more contrast here. Probably shadows I'll increase to, let's say, 0.5. Midtones, again, I want more contrast, so I'm going to decrease the midtones to, let's say, 0.9. And my white point value, on my digital camera for an exterior daylight scene, it has a white point value, a preset white point value of 5400. So I'm just going to plug that value in here, and let's just give that a render. Okay, I like the image. This image has a little more contrast in it. I think I need to increase the warmth of that sunlight source. I'm going to increase the red value here on the sun setting. And also, since it's a little bit either later or earlier in the day, the sun is closer to the horizon, what I want to do is I want to increase the softness value. And as I increase that, it's going to blur the shadows more, so there'll be more grain unless I add more samples. So I'm going to increase the samples to, I'll just double that and say 16. May not be high enough, but probably good enough for just a test render here. And what I'll do is give this another render. Okay, so as you can see, it's softened those shadows really nice now. So at this point, what I want to do is I'm planning on rendering this image out larger than what you see here. So probably double the resolution than what it currently is. What I like to do is go ahead and save this calculation. And what I'm going to do is turn it up on, I'll probably just set it up for high for the final render. And I'm going to save this out to a map. Let's just call this exterior 01. And what I'll do is save this to a map, freeze it, and then change my resolution to increase it to do the final render. The reason for doing that is that it will calculate faster at the smaller resolution, and once I freeze it and then render at the high resolution, you won't really tell much of a difference, provided that you don't go crazy and calculate this final gather solution at like 200 pixels and then try to render something out at 2000 pixels. That's too far of a span, and there just won't be enough resolution in the final gather calculation to support such a high jump in resolution. So generally, I keep it around 50%. So if I'm going to, for example, if I want to have my final resolution at 1000 by 1000 pixels, then I'll calculate my final gather solution at 500 by 500 pixels. And when you calculate a smaller resolution like that, generally you'll want to use a higher preset. When you calculate at a larger resolution, Final Gather actually creates more points automatically. So if I was going to calculate this at 1000 pixels, then I may be able to get by with some a medium or a low setting, just because it is sort of Final Gather depends on resolution, and that it creates more points at a higher resolution. So as you go up in screen resolution, watch this and see if you can decrease your Final Gather settings. But for the small resolution, I'm going to leave it at high and go ahead and generate this Final Gather map. And this will take a few minutes, so I'll go ahead and pause the video. Alright, so now that the calculation is complete, what I'll do is freeze this Final Gather map, come to my output size settings, and let's change this back to something like 900 by 675. And of course I want to modify the anti-aliasing settings, because this is going to be a larger render here. So I will increase the image precision to minimum 1, maximum 16. And go ahead and give this a render. And as you can see, it goes directly into rendering the image instead of any calculations. Okay, so there's the completed render using the smaller Final Gather map. And the output looks okay here. As you can see, there's quite a bit of detail, ornate detail, in this model. And what I could do is, naturally, I could keep increasing the Final Gather settings to bring out some more of this detail. But in reality, probably the easiest thing to do here would be to use the ambient occlusion option on this mental ray shader, mental ray material that's applied to the mesh here. So what I'll do is enable ambient occlusion, and I'm going to send this out for a maximum distance of let's say 16 inches, and so I want to increase the samples, let's say something like 32. Let's make that 24. So what this is going to do is measure out 16 inches, give some occlusion with that distance, and that will bring out some of the details here. What I'll do is put the original render here in the RAM player. And I'll move that off screen. And then just give this another render with the ambient occlusion. Alright, that render is complete. As you can see, I don't know if you noticed, but the previous render time was about 5 minutes and 24 seconds, I believe. This render time went to 7 minutes and 17 seconds just by adding the ambient occlusion. But remember, I also used 24 samples, so it was doing a little more sampling. And so that's the reason for the increase in render time. But what I'll do is add this into the RAM player, this latest render in. So channel B here is the original render, channel A will be the ambient occlusion render, and you can see how that's brought out more details here in the structure itself. Oftentimes you'll want to use that just because Final Gather tends to provide a softer indirect illumination solution that would often require ambient occlusion like this just to bring out some of the extra details. If not, then you would often need to use very high Final Gather settings, which is cost prohibitive as far as render time. So that ambient occlusion effect on the A&D shaders and the A&D material and the Pro materials is a really nice feature to have. So with this scene, I could probably take this into Photoshop, because generally I look at a render as the first step, and Photoshop as the final way to complete these things off and do some adjustments, increase the contrast some more, because it still looks a little bit flat, a little bit dull here. So, but I think that's a good intro to rendering a scene. Just a basic, put the model in there, texture it, add your daylight system, and configure Final Gather. So what I'll look at next is, let's see if we want to change views here. And let's go to a different camera angle. And what I want to do in this viewport and this angle is in the exposure control, maybe enable some vignetting, maybe increase the highlights and burn just a little bit more, and let's move the sun around a little bit. Let's put it on this side. Now, since I've moved the sunlight source, the Final Gather calculation here is no longer valid. That's one point that I'd like to make here. In the animation scene that I showed previously, where I went through and showed how to set this up, I used these saved maps because this is a fly-through animation, and the saved maps, when I say saved maps, I'm talking about like the saved Final Gather map as well as the saved photon map. They work well in fly-through scenarios, but if something was moving in this scene, such as the chair was moving, or my light source was changing intensity, if the sun was moving, if this was like a daylight study, then I would not be able to use this saved map. What I would want to do is just calculate the Final Gather for each frame. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, that's a slower process, but generally these maps are best used when the only thing that's changing in the scene is the camera. So if you're going to move the light source, then what you're going to have to do is recalculate this Final Gather solution. And this time around, what I'll do is set the noise filtering to none. And also, I want to modify this max reflections on the trace depth. If you notice, I have 3 bounces here. And what will happen is these numbers will limit the number of bounces. For example, if I wanted 10 bounces, then actually it's going to stop at 5 because this trace depth limits the diffuse bounces. So what I'll do is set this back to 5 and then 3. So I just want to make sure that these values are equal to or higher than my bounce, my Final Gather bounce setting. And once again, what I'll do is decrease the image size here. So for the calculation phase, and make sure I have this set up correctly, I'm going to use the high setting again. And I think what I'll do is change the sun color here. Let's raise this up a little. I'm going to decrease the red tint to this just because the sun's a little bit higher in the sky. And what I'll do is go ahead and calculate this Final Gather map. Okay, so the Final Gather map is complete now, so what I'll do is just freeze it. Again, come in and increase the render size and render the final image. And there's the completed render. As you can see, the vignetting option on the exposure control does a pretty good job of framing this image here by darkening the edges so that the focal point is here on the center. But that I believe will conclude the section on lighting an exterior scene with the mental ray sun and sky. What I'll do next is light the scene with maybe an HDR and get some different lighting techniques that way. So I'll do that next.